I lost all language. I literally had a silent mind. Imagine, you would notice if your brain all of a sudden had no language whatsoever. It wasn't talking to you anymore. It was saying nothing. Well, in order for me to know who I am, my brain says to me, I am Jill Bolte Taylor. You ask me what my name is, and I know who I am because my brain tells me who I am. As I lost that identity, as I lost those cells, I lost the part of my brain that told me, where do I live? What is my address? People would say, squeeze my hand. And it's like, well, I don't know what a squeeze is or a hand is. So I have no idea what you're talking about. And so they get louder and they squeeze my hand. And it's like, I am not deaf. I have no language. I simply cannot understand what you're saying to me.
Welcome to Seriously Catherine, a self-confidence podcast for women who want to be taken seriously in the world of business. Here's your guest host, Dympna Weil.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Seriously Catherine, the podcast takeover. I'm your host, Dympna Weil, and this is our third episode of Prescribing Possibility. So glad to have you back. Today, we are joined by an extraordinary woman by the name of Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor. And for those of you who know her, you will already be getting all excited to hear what she has to say. For those of you who are not familiar with her, Dr. Taylor is a neuroanatomist who was trained at Harvard. She has dedicated her entire life to studying the brain anatomy. She was one of the first people to actually have a TED Talk that went viral as she told her story of when, at 37 years old, she suffered from a hemorrhagic stroke. And being a brain scientist, she absolutely knew what was happening to her from the moment it started, as she puts it, as her brain went offline. And she details that story and then talks about her recovery and what she learned through that process in that TED Talk. She wrote a book called My Stroke of Insight. Now, years later, she has a new book called Whole Brain Living, The Anatomy of Choice and the Four Characters That Drive Our Life. And she is going to join us today to talk about that new book, the things that she has learned since that experience. You're in for a treat if you have never been exposed to her work, her story. So get ready. But first, we have a hot take. The hot take is brought to you by Paint and Sip. The 2024 Summer Olympics just wrapped in Paris, France, and we had so many memorable moments. And it was filled with enormously talented athletes. But I would be absolutely remiss to not mention that the women absolutely rocked it. And it was the absolute year of the woman. It was exhilarating to root them on, to see all of the things that they accomplished to, live out their dreams. The first we have to mention, of course, is the GOAT. The greatest of all time, Simone Biles, giving herself that self-compassion last time when she was in Tokyo, recognizing she was not well in her own body and that she could not continue on, pulling herself out of the Olympics and taking care of herself despite what everyone else was saying about her and tending to her own mental health, took courage, and then coming back because she loved the sport. What a lesson for all of us to witness that. And then to come back and just absolutely kill it. I mean, that to me, you could just watch that and the Olympics were that just wraps it all up with a bow. But there was more. We also saw her age match in swimming. My daughter's a swimmer, so we watched a lot of swimming. Katie Ledecky. I mean, she is just an outstanding human being who helps all of the younger swimmers and all the younger athletes. She is just an incredible role model for so many. And to see her excel at her sport and just say so positive and love it so much, it's really, heartening, and that they're excelling at their respective sports at 27 when they had been told at younger ages that they would, not be able to continue competing at those levels. It's really just awe-inspiring. And then I'm going to switch over to fencing, because how can you not just be, gobsmacked when you think about these two women fencers? The first is the United States gold medal fencer from the women's individual foil category, Lee Kiefer, third-year medical student. What? That's not hard enough? Training for the Olympics isn't difficult enough? Being a third-year medical student isn't difficult enough. Talk about determination, hard work, perseverance, all the things. It also speaks to keeping true to who you are and holding on to the things that make you you, and keeping connected to activities that light you up. That is going to serve her so well as she continues in her medical career. And that is really going to help combat some burnout. So keep on keeping on, Lee. Wishing you all the success in the world. And then finally, there is Dr. Nada Hafez, the Egyptian fencer, who on the podium, 7 months pregnant. She's a clinical pathologist. So went to medical school, fencing for Egypt at the Olympic level, and was a prior national gymnastics champion in Egypt as well. If this wasn't the year of the woman at the Olympics, I don't know what was. That's my hot take for today. So the serious business lesson from Prescribing Possibility, lesson number 3 is always try to find a way to yes. So if you're here listening and you are a business owner and you want something for you and your business, this is the best thing I can tell you that I have learned. Say yes to whatever it is that you want most, and then figure out the details, figure out a way to get there. Because most of the time, it's just, you have to just fill in the details later. You can work out how to get there. This is so great. So Natalie, our writer, she was to cover the Fasig-Tipton sale, the Saratoga sale. And she just hit it out of the park, right? So she said yes to going. And then poor thing was on the sidelines sick. And I'll let you read the whole story because she writes about it so beautifully. But she's unable to go. And having said yes, she figured out a way to get the story and sends her friend. And it is so awesomely written. We were laughing and giggling to hear the whole thing. But say yes to what it is you want most. Go after it. And then work out how to get there, because there's always going to be a way. You may have to be creative in how you get there. You may have to give up some things and make some concessions. And the other person that's involved in that process, or the many people involved, may have to too. But you're going to find a way to get there. So say yes to yourself, say yes to what it is you want most, and then figure it out. I love the idea of being able to just peel back layers of what goes on in our town. And it's not the stuff you just see on the front pages. It's really getting behind the scenes. The detail and the level of intimacy of what's going on really just makes you want to be even more a part of our community, because it just invites you in. It's a great piece. And you can check out the Substack link in our bio. Dr. Taylor, thank you so very much for being here today. Most people will be familiar with you and your work from your TED Talk, the first viral TED Talk in history, for your work on My Stroke of Insight, one of my favorite books.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you for writing it. And your follow-up, The Whole Brain Living, which I was fortunate enough to take that course with you last year. But for those people who have not heard you describe your story or who aren't familiar with your story? I'm sure you have shared it so many times at this point, but would you be so kind as to share your story in your own words?
Yeah, I was a brain scientist at Harvard. I grew up to study the brain because I have a brother who would eventually be diagnosed with the brain disorder schizophrenia. So as a child, of course, we don't know that the brain can be ill. All we know is that this person is different from me. And my brother was just very different from me in the way he experienced or perceived our experiences. And so I became very aware of facial language, body language, tone of voice. What am I as a living being? I just became fascinated with me as a human. And eventually my brother would be diagnosed with the brain disorder schizophrenia. And in the meantime, I grew up to study the anatomy of the brain. My focus was on how does our brain create our perception of reality at a cellular level. So I was teaching and performing research at Harvard Medical School, and I woke up one morning and I had a major hemorrhage in the left half of my brain. And this is my area of expertise. So, I'm fascinated with whatever's going on and all this neurological weirdness. And I literally, over the course of 4 hours, got to watch my own brain completely deteriorate in its ability to process any information. So I ended up having this major hemorrhage. It wiped out the left hemisphere of my brain. And 2.5 weeks after the hemorrhage happened, I had major surgery, a craniotomy. They went in, they removed a blood clot the size of a golf ball and said, we have no idea how much you'll get back. But go do whatever you're going to do. So I did. And I actually used the knowledge of my right brain to rebuild the circuitry of my left brain, because I had a basic understanding about how cells work in circuits, which circuits had gone offline that morning, and where they were, and then trying to figure out, okay, well, what do they need in order to recover? So, when we think about deficit from a brain trauma, let's say my motor cortex in my left hemisphere gets wiped out and I have paralysis on the right side of my body. Well, the right side of my body is still okay. The problem is these cells inside of my brain. So what do those cells need in order to regain health so that I can then regain the function in my body? So it was through my eyes, a fascinating exploration into my own brain and body and how this thing works and what's actually going on in these two very different hemispheres. What do they both bring to the composite of what am I as a human being?
It's to hear you describe it, it's fascinating, right? So many people would not look at it that way. But
I understand that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I had read somewhere, it was like a New York Times article, I think, where you had just mentioned it, that people don't always, focus on what abilities the person has lost, but rather, you marvel at the insights that can be gained because of that experience. Right. And I took that as such a beautiful way of looking at what has come from that experience, not only in your own personal life, but like what the world has gained from your experience.
Yeah.
It's remarkable. Now, I also, when you wrote your first book, that was written after your recovery, which was an 8-year process. Can you describe a little bit, when things come online and you're talking about the circuitry, as a physician, I'm just very curious. How did that process happen?
Well, you're correct in saying it's a process. People say, when did you recover? And I say, well, when did I recover what? Right. It's all cells. It's all circuits. And so, my mother's priority was that I was alive and I survived the surgery. And she had been working with me for those 2.5 weeks to try to give me some language, because if I'm going to be a functional human being in the world, I have to have language. Language is the standard. If I don't have a way to communicate with you, you're not going to communicate with me. And you're going to see me as non-communicative. And therefore I live on the sideline of humanity. So my mother was very wise to kind of close out all other factors and focus on sound. Can I create a sound? Because I lost all language. I literally had a silent mind. Imagine you would notice if your brain all of a sudden had no language whatsoever. It wasn't talking to you anymore. It was saying nothing. Well, in order for me to know who I am, my brain says to me, I am Jill Bolte Taylor. You ask me what my name is, and I know who I am because my brain tells me who I am. Well, I could go by any name, right? But my name on my birth certificate is Jill Bolte Taylor. And so that's where it all begins, is I have an identity. Well, as I lost that identity, as I lost those cells, I lost the part of my brain that told me, where do I live? What is my address? People would say, squeeze my hand. And it's like, well, I don't know what a squeeze is or a hand is. So I have no idea what you're talking about. And so they get louder and they squeeze my hand. And it's like, I am not deaf. I have no language. I simply cannot understand what you're saying to me. So, I have so much to say about what we could do differently about how we help people recover, but that's not our conversation today. But the point was, well, bring me back. We'll talk about that. With language gone, all I had was the present moment. And language is a semantic. It's a storyline. And there's a beginning and an end. And in the left hemisphere, there's a linearity of time. I have a past and I have a future. But in the absence of the left hemisphere, not only did I lose me, the individual, but I lost temporality of time. So all I had was the present moment. So how does one take the present moment and build a future when they don't have the tools that are required in order for me to even understand, oh, that person I was speaking to a moment ago is still back there, and I have now turned my back on them, so they are no longer in my present. And so they're gone. All I have is you in front of me. And so I can't learn. And if I can't, because I have to be able to refer back to what I have learned in the past to make a comparison in order to come up with something new. And that's the nature of learning. So I didn't have the capacity to learn in the normal way that our society knows how to teach. And because of that, it was a challenge. And I was just very blessed to have my particular mother who, she just loved me no matter what I was, whatever I was. She looked at my ability, not my disability. She looked at what I had gained, not what I had lost. And she did not let me lose sight of my value simply because I was alive. I was still alive. And because I was alive, there was the potential for something now.
That is, as you describe that, it makes my heart kind of leap because, you think about all of the people involved in a recovery as you're describing. I can only imagine that the care teams didn't quite know what to do with you because.
Well, that's the thing.
Yeah.
If I don't have language, they can't speak to me.
Yeah.
They can't say, this is your medication, take your medication. I mean, it was like, I didn't know what a medication was. I didn't know what any of the language was. I didn't know what they were saying to me. I'm paralyzed on the right side of my body. I feel like a ton of lead. I have no strength in my hands. And they're presenting on my food tray one of those cute little cartons of milk, unopened. And I'm supposed to open it.
Yeah. And how are you supposed to take care of yourself? Yeah, right.
And I'm looking at them going, you have no idea how to communicate with me. How vulnerable am I? Because now I'm in the care of people who think we communicate through language, but how do you communicate with someone who now doesn't have language? And then they get louder and they speak to you because they're thinking that you can't hear. And it's like, then you're even scarier because now you're raising your voice and energetically you're blasting me. And I'm just getting the message 100% that we do not know how to communicate with people who are in this condition. Right. And it made it perfectly clear to me that other than my mother, who was protecting my sleep, protecting my food when she got there, and she took care of all my needs and set me up for success. If I hadn't had my mother, I wouldn't be speaking to you today.
That is such a testament to like love in motion right there.
Love. She just loved me no matter what my condition. She had hope and she had love. And that's where we began.
Yeah. And that relates back to a lot of what you write about in your second book, in Whole Brain Living, where you talk a lot about the two different parts of the brain, or the four different parts of the brain and the two different sides, and a lot about energy. And so I would love to share with our listeners. Some may be very, very well acquainted with the energetic part of your work, but as you were just talking now about how people would come into the room, you have this very profound statement that just, it's written in my kitchen on a chalkboard.
Oh, excellent. As it should be written everywhere.
Everywhere.
Please take responsibility for the energy you bring into this space.
Mm-hmm. And everyone who walks into my house looks at it.
Yeah.
It's profound. Thank you.
No, well, yeah. Thank me, but thank you, because that's it. I mean, I'm a ball of energy. You know, I am this life force power of 50 trillion molecular geniuses. This is what we are as human beings. We have cells that allow us to move our body. We have cells that allow us to speak. We have cells that allow us to have vision. We have cells that allow us to sleep. We have cells that allow us to rage and get angry. We have cells that allow us, every ability we have is because we have cells that perform that function. So if that's the case, what say do I have? What say do any of us have in which of those circuits we run at any time? What power do we have as human beings to choose who and how we want to be? And I'm a firm believer, based on my experience of having lost all abilities of that left hemisphere, which is how do I make myself a functional human being in society and relate the internal world of what I am as a living being to the social norm and you know, just choices that we're making. And we have so much more power than we've been trained to understand or believe. And that's kind of what whole brain living brings into the world is, you know, through the anatomy of our brain, we have these different groups of cells that perform specific collections, constellations of abilities that end up coming up out of us and looking like personalities in the world. So we end up, each of us, with these four very specific characters. And I'm a firm believer that the better you know your four characters, then you have the power to choose which of those you want to dominate in any moment. And boy, is that personal freedom.
Yeah. And it's, I remember the first time I heard you speak on it, and it struck me because I could immediately identify, particularly because, and so for the listeners, I just want to point out, this is the book we're speaking of. You can see it is well read and notes taken, pictures drawn. I've read it like 3 times. Seriously.
I love that.
And the 4 different characters that Dr. Jill will probably speak a little bit more of, but there is one character in particular, character 4, that we'll get into, but it is this like omnipresent universe being at one really with with every bit of energy in the world.
And being good with it. Oh my God, I'm alive.
Yeah, right.
Oh my God, I'm alive.
Yeah. And this is something that I can so relate to since I was a kid. And having that awe of just, and really remembering that kind of being dialed down the further I went into my medical training.
Sadly.
Yeah. But I could really identify with all of the characters as you were describing them. It's fascinating.
Yeah. And if there's four in each one of us, that means in every relationship, there's 8 of us. No wonder relationships are so challenging. Yeah. Right? Yeah. If we line up, there's certain parts of us that are going to line up really well. And you just gave a great example. If you're going to go to medical school, you have to turn on your character 1 left thinking. This is your rational brain. It's details, more details about those details. And you have to build this foundation of information. Start with anatomy, add in movement, creation, physiology, add in movement of the body, kinesiology, add in all the chemistry, biochemistry, add in disease, pathology. I mean, so your details, billions of bits of data, and you got to show up as a medical student as a really strong, capable character 1, or you're just going to get devoured by a system and you're not going to achieve, because that's how you achieve. And that's the portion of your brain that you use for that. But if you're all tangled up in that, and I teach in medical school, so I understand. I love my medical students, but it is like, this is a full-time job. It is 24/7 and 365 days a year for 4 years. And it is like, you have to hang on and show up 100% and look at yourself as a whole person. Because if you don't get enough sleep, you can't remember those details. If you're not paying attention to what you're eating and you're sticking garbage in your body, then you're going to hit a lull in the middle of the afternoon and you're still in class. You can't absorb it. I mean, you have to look at yourself as this whole organism and say, okay, then how do I capitalize on all the different parts of me so that I can work with me and show up as my best self in order to do that? Well, if your prayers part of yourself, if you're open, expansive, loving, connection to all that is part of yourself now gets stuck on a back burner, because first of all, the medical world doesn't really have a whole lot of appreciation about, that piece of who we are. So you probably can't talk about it a whole lot when you're in medical school, right? I mean, it's like, who's nurturing this part of yourself? And what do you do? What is your own pattern response to do you meditate, in order to bring peace between moments of just absorb? The beauty of being a human is we're alive. We are alive. We're not a machine that you plug in and it's on and then it runs out and it dies and then you go and buy a new one, right? We're not like that. We're biological systems. We have a push and then we have a pause. And in the pause, things get integrated and learned. And then we have a push and we can bring in more. And then we have a pause. And in the pause, even as a circadian rhythm of we're awake and then we're asleep. Right. We're awake. We're bringing in all this information and then we go to sleep and then all the cells are going, okay, let's organize. Let's, clean out all the waste and let's, cause we're living cells are eating and creating waste. And if we don't get enough sleep, we're foggy in the brain. Why is that? Because we haven't cleared out the waste, right? We need to let the garbage cleaners come in and do their business. So to really appreciate the vast variety of what we are as human beings, wow, all of a sudden it's like, okay, I like me. I like all these different parts of who I am. I even love my misery. I tell people, if you're miserable, I don't mind if you're miserable as long as you remember to enjoy it. I mean, for gosh sakes, we have misery circuitry, right? Yeah. Okay, I'm going to be miserable. Right now, I'm going to be angry. Right now, I'm going to be this or that or the other. And it's like, okay, well, I ran that circuit. Now I can move on to something else. But recognizing I'm this biological mass, I'm not written in stone. I have the ability to shift and purposely choose different circuitry to run. So I have the power to choose who and how I want to be in any circumstance. Yeah. And to me, that's just, a very peaceful, lovely, human way of living.
Yeah, I want to go back to a couple things you said. Yes,
there was a lot in there, wasn't there?
There was a lot. There's a lot of really good stuff, Dr. Jill.
A lot in there,
man. My God, there's so much good stuff in there. And yes, it's very peaceful, right? But there's something about agency, right? Because I think that is a very powerful thing, to know that we have agency.
How do you define agency? I think this is one of the most interesting new subjects. It's kind of a word I didn't hear a lot of, and now I'm hearing it all the time. How do you define agency?
To me, agency is knowing that I have the ability to make a decision, to have that contemplative moment, to choose. But that I have that ability to contemplate my next move. But that I really do have that ability. Yes. So it's that knowing.
Yes.
And thank you for asking.
Yes. The
other point that I love is that you own, like when you said you own your anger or you own your misery. The thing I really want to share with the listeners that you write about in your book, and I talk to clients all the time when I'm coaching physicians, right, is that it's the 90-second rule. You talk about the circuitry, right? Any of these feelings that we're experiencing physiologically, they last for 90 seconds. Right?
Yeah.
We can tolerate it. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. It's just a tolerance.
And I encourage people to time it. So essentially, if I get emotionally triggered and I'm going to be angry, from the moment I feel my circuits going, as soon as I move into my anger circuit, the whole constellation of things happen. For me, I feel it in my chest. My chest constricts. I feel it in my shoulders. My shoulders come forward. My jaw clamps, my furrow in my brow, my voice comes, it's all that is going on. My body language, does whatever my body language is going to do. So, as soon as I'm triggered, all that happens. I become aware of, okay, I'm in that loop. And then I can step into another part of my brain, which is 3/4 of my brain, and observe myself now. Yeah, I'm feeling triggered. What am I going to do? I can throw my fist. Of course I can do that. I can yell and scream. Of course I can do that. I can go hide. Of course I can do that. I can go numb and just witness, and I can, so I have all these options. So what do I choose, especially knowing, and now I'm observing myself run through my anger circuit instead of simply engaging in running the circuit. So as soon as I bring my mind and my awareness into observing instead of engaging, I've taken the power out of the automatic replay part of the system. Otherwise, I can stay angry for, I'm ranting rave for 20 minutes. Easy.
Right. And that's how we just brood and we just stick in it. Me too. Yeah. You just
and it feels so good.
Doesn't it?
And there's something addictive about it, right? And that's because the craving in the addiction circuit is a part of that group of cells as well. So it's like, well, I'm madder in hell and I want to stay madder in hell because when I'm madder in hell, I know who I am when I'm madder in hell and I'm madder in hell and I'm going to be madder in hell because I have a right to be madder in hell because you did me wrong. And it's like, hello, how does that feel inside of your body? It feels violent. We're having violence within ourselves. And this is simply not healthy for my cellular circuitry. But just in knowing that circuit's going to run, it's triggered and it's going to run, and I don't have to act out on it, right? I don't have to say horrible things. I don't have to throw my fist. I don't have to do any of that. I can simply observe I'm feeling triggered. and I'm just going to wait 90 seconds. And the same, it's kind of like, count to 10.
Right. Mm-hmm.
You count to 10, it's kind of the same impact. I'm now putting the energy of my physiology into not running that circuit. It's triggered, it's going to run, but now I'm choosing another behavior or, put me in the corner, or I'm going to take myself out of a situation and put myself in isolation because I just want to let it shift by without more of the negative stimulation coming at me. So I think that the real point is that we're making these decisions every moment of our existence. Are we running automatic habitual patterning?
Right.
Or are we actually recognizing I have neuroplasticity? Neuroplasticity is the ability of my brain cells to rearrange which other cells they're running, so I can actually purposely decrease circuitry and then put the energy into other circuits and create other habits on purpose that I would rather run when that stimulation hits. So that let's say you and I, we just squabble all the time. Let's say we're sisters and we just squabble all the time. And you come in and you just, and I look at you and I go, and you look at me and you, and this is what, because this is our dance we've been doing for like 50 years, right? Sorry if I just aged you. But that's the dance we do. Well, what happens now if all of a sudden you come to me and you're back to, and I just kind of look at you and I think, you've got mom's eyes. They're really pretty eyes. And I think this to myself. And instead of reacting back in the same old loop, I move into a different part of my brain where I can really shift my perception of you and recognize that there's this beauty in you. And I'm so sorry that you're feeling emotionally triggered because I don't mean to do that with you. And I'd rather have a loving relationship with you and a supportive relationship with you. And so I can actually make a conscious decision that the next time I hear you coming into my room, it's like, okay, and if whatever you present to me, whatever energy you bring into my space, I don't have to jump in and play that same dance. I can actually take responsibility for the energy I emit to you, and I can choose to be loving.
Oh, I love that so very much. And this actually, I think, answers a question that I was going to raise, which was, as we are now in August and kind of going into that season of 2024 where, people really dig into their beliefs and the divisiveness of our country and the rhetoric is ramped up with the election coming. And it's so difficult, as time has gone on to have really civil conversations. There was a time where we could just have different opinions and have a conversation about it. And that has increasingly become difficult.
Yeah.
Because, people aren't really willing to engage that way anymore.
Yeah.
So it sounds to me, and you can tell me where I'm wrong, that the whole brain living framework, like you just described with us, the squabbling sisters, really, it helps me as the individual with my own anger loop, because that's tied to the addiction loop as well. So you get addicted to that behavior.
Yeah.
So it can help me understand myself and not engage.
Right.
So it helps us to understand the other person, knowing that they are engaged in that loop. So it's almost like they can't get out of it.
I think that the way I look at this, because, we're in it, we've been in it, it's deep. And, it's to the point where you meet new people in different situations and you resonate and you really enjoy them because our differences hasn't had the light shine on it. So if we choose to shine the light on our similarities, then we can still care about one another, enjoy one another, play cards with one another, go dancing with one another, go do whatever we do with one another, right? in a positive way. We get in trouble then when somebody decides, okay, I'm going to take my beliefs and I'm going to push them on to you, whichever side you're on, right?
Right.
Because that makes me right and you wrong. So now we have the left brain coming in and saying we're separate and we're different, and we're focusing on the separate and the difference instead of choosing to look at the similarity. Well, I mean, how often does it happen? Let's say we're in a grocery store and all of a sudden something happens and we're all together to protect ourselves, right? We're not about our differences now. Who cares about politics in an emergency? We don't. Right? I'm not focused on, oh, well, I'm not going to save you because you're them instead of us, but that's still me making the decision and judgment of my own. So we're all guilty of the engagement of making the other, and the other is usually wrong, right? So if I can look at you and you're putting me as the other and I am now wrong because you're all about whatever you are, I don't have to buy it that. Right? I can look at you and recognize this person is currently running the left emotional circuitry in their brain. And they're doing that because something has triggered their circuit that says I'm different from them. And so they're not feeling safe. Period. They're not feeling safe. As soon as we move into that circuitry, I'm not familiar. My beliefs aren't familiar, or my looks aren't familiar enough. Because that tissue in that emotional group of cells of the left hemisphere, alarm, alarm, alert, alert, it only feels safe when it is in what is familiar. So we are essentially programmed. Now, I'll give you a great example. I grew up in Indiana, Terre Haute, Indiana, tiny, it's not a tiny town, but it's rural America. And 65 years ago, we had a African-American population that was pretty small, relatively speaking, and we had Caucasian. We didn't see Asians. There just weren't a lot of Asians in my immediate environment. So I am not familiar with Asian and Asian population. So now if you go and you look at that town, a whole lot of the physicians, a whole lot of the professionals in the town are actually a really healthy Asian population. So that group of Caucasian, brought up in Caucasian, unfamiliar with Asian, we either respond with fear, you're different from me, I'm going to push myself away because I don't understand you, and your food smells different than my food, and your clothing is different than what I'm comfortable with because it's my past experience. So I can approach you with fear, or I can shift into the same limbic emotional tissue of my right hemisphere, and I can say, oh, you're different. I've never met someone from Korea or from India. And you wear different clothing, your color, I'm curious, tell me more, right? So I either go toward that which is unfamiliar, or I shy from that which is familiar. So I think when we understand the circuitry of the brain, it just helps us make more sense out of our own natural instincts and our behavior. But as biological creatures, we're designed to grow. That's why we have a past and a future. Otherwise, we'd just always be in the present moment, and we probably wouldn't last very long because we'd be constantly reinventing the wheel of everything, which means we would not learn, right? We're not capable of learning. But because we're capable of learning and growing, I can meet someone who's different from me. If I don't feel familiar and I don't feel safe, I can observe a little with curiosity, and then ultimately perhaps choose to engage and grow as more of a whole human being, because this is part of my human family. These people may be different in their environmental or biological specifics, but they're still part of my human family. I can grow and learn from them. Diversity then becomes something that contributes to my growth and awareness and wonder of what we are as human beings, instead of me constricting and shying away and pushing that away and saying, no, that's bad.
Right. That makes so much sense. And I think that's really, really helpful in terms of just allowing us to have yet another tool to help with our own understanding, right? Because I think that it's just important for us to, well, one, understand ourselves better, right? Mm-hmm. That's always a benefit, but to understand others, I think that's another enormous benefit of the work that you have done here. And for anybody who hasn't read the book, I'm going to plug it again, because again, I have read it so many times, that if you haven't read it, you can listen to it. It is just a really beautiful.
Sounds just like me.
Yeah. But it's a beautiful guidebook. That's how I looked at it, like a guidebook. And it changed the way I viewed, myself. I felt like, you're part of something bigger. So I just encourage everybody to have a read if they haven't. Now, one thing I'll share with the audience is that last summer, Dr. Jill offered, it was kind of like a beta group of a program, and I was so fortunate to be among the group. I understand that you are running some programs now in Chicago in a school system. That's still going, right?
Yes.
Will you tell us about that and some of the other sectors where you're doing your whole brain living work? Because it sounds amazing to be working with groups of people.
I'm the kind of person that, I'm just one woman, and I'm an adjunct at the Indiana University School of Medicine, an adjunct at DePaul University in Chicago, Department of Education. So I'm really a neuroscientist and an educator. And
a phenom. I think you're selling yourself short there. You're a lot more than just one woman. You are a phenom, but go on.
Okay. But energetically, I am as big as the universe.
There you have it. Okay. That sounds better.
Sure. But we all are. But I actually know it,
Yes.
And it's a different life when you live your life like you're a big ball of energy, big as the universe. But anyway, so whole brain living, it took me a while to be able to put into language, what did I learn when I lost my left hemisphere and all I had was the right hemisphere? And then I used the right hemisphere over the course of 8 years to rebuild the circuitry and relationship with the right hemisphere in order so I could become a whole brain person. I could have all of this brain to work with. And I finally figured it out in my language through the anatomy of the brain, how to communicate this in a way that people could get it and actually use it and value it. And that is the contents of the book you're talking about, Whole Brain Living, the anatomy of choice and the 4 characters that drive our life, and how to know these different parts of who we are, how to bring them into communication with one another. And then this is my brain team. And then I live myself based on all 4 of my characters, and how do I make them all happy? How do they work together and negotiate in order for me to live a really peaceful life? Because to me, that is personal freedom. And who doesn't want personal freedom? So I work with people. People come to me and they say, I love your work. I work in the school system. I'd like to work with you on bringing whole brain living into school communities. So right now I'm working with Dr. Donna Keel at DePaul. And for the last few years, they ran research in the DePaul school system and other schools, public schools and private schools of different age groups. But we're not educating the children. We're educating the administrators and teachers and everybody, all the adults in the school system and the parents. So we're educating the village within which our children live. And if they become more conscious, and they do, the data shows, and they understand the four characters, and they're going to approach the children very differently. And then they can use the language of whole brain living and teach the kids by example and by principle. And that way we don't go through the curricular system, which is a very political system.
Right.
And instead of dealing with that system, we're going from this way. So whole brain living is going into different school communities. And the best way to work with me then is for somebody to come to me and say, I work with physicians on, there's a high rate of suicide. There's a high rate of suicide in judges, a high rate of suicide in firefighters, in police officers. There's a high rate of suicide in our society. So I work with different people who work with those different populations. And I'm kind of the touchstone big mama neuron, but they are whole people in themselves, because I do ask them to work with me and become advanced in whole brain living. Because if I live and breathe whole brain living in my own world, I get it and I understand it and I can really share it. And that's very different than somebody just coming in, learning the material and then teaching it. It's like, it's a practice. It's not simply something to learn. It's something to live. Absolutely. And when people live and breathe their own whole brain living, they're at peace with themselves. And it's easier then to walk the walk and talk the talk and share the information in a way that is really in-depth, meaningful. So, I work with a retired judge who cares about the mental health of judges. And so he is actively taking whole brain living to different conferences and Zooms and, ways of communicating with that population. He and another colleague of mine are actually taking it into prison systems. So now imagine that here you're an inmate in a prison. Your alarm, alert has to be on all the time. I'm just guessing, right? I haven't had that experience, but I'm guessing that there's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of, how do I even get to my cognitive learning when I'm don't feel safe, right?
Right.
So these individuals are taking whole brain living into the prison system so that people can understand, well, yes, you're active in this part of your brain, but you also have these other parts of your brain. And usually then it helps them understand what was the conflict, the internal conflict that got them into trouble in the first place and put into this type of an institution. I was working with somebody who works with the police and educating the police force on the four characters inside of themselves and the public, and how to look at the public and the people they come up against, or called for, and how to de-escalate circumstances when you have someone in that alarm, alert, whether they're feeling betrayed and they're madder than hell, or they're just in that character too hostile, or whether they're on drugs. And how does one recognize the difference between someone who's on drugs and someone who has a severe mental illness? Because they kind of tend to look a lot alike. When an animal, we are animals, when an human animal is cornered, we all come out pretty much looking the same, right? We either wilt down and crawl in the corner and give it up, or we come out fighting because that's what we're programmed to do at an anatomical level. So whole brain living, going into different parts of the population. Many of the people who are interested in awakening, what does it mean to become awakened? What does that mean? And it's like, well, it means that the left hemisphere characters are calm and quiet enough that I can come into the present moment And without the distraction of my monkey mind, or whatever you want to call the language centers of that left hemisphere, in the absence of that, or any of the emotional fear or anger or blame or guilt or shame or sadness, or, these beautiful, beautiful, rich emotions that make life fulfilled in so many ways. These are tools that our brain uses for us to grow and learn. So some people say, oh, I want to squash that part of me out. And it's like, oh no, this is a red flag saying I feel pain, which means we need to bring the other parts of our brain to pay attention to this, because there's something here for us to learn, so that we can grow and we can find peace again. So we're just this magnificent diversity, and it just equals the level of diversity of how people are using whole brain living with their populations in the world. It's just been a beautiful, beautiful experience.
That is magnificent. And I hope that all of these populations will be sharing how their experiences are going, because I think it's remarkable to see that, and I think a lot of the populations, physicians in particular, but I can imagine a lot of, teachers and other places, they like to see the data, right? Because unfortunately we laud thought over feeling. In society, and we want to see that there is, some evidence.
Yeah, and it is. Dr. Donna did this study where they compared. They did it over a period of time, and they did all these measurements. And we had a wonderful team. I didn't. I was kind of like on the outside looking in, because they wanted it to be independent of me, which I appreciated. Mm-hmm. But I helped them build this magnificent team, and the stats are just beautiful. But what they really learned was that it has tremendous value for those who practice it. But if they don't practice it, then it doesn't have an impact. Well, sure. I think we could have told them that from the beginning, right? But it's nice to know that if you do practice it, then actually it has this long-term, very positive impact, and it can literally shift the consciousness of populations and how people deal and manage and interact with other people at a more conscious level. So the data's there. It's been presented at least 2 conferences, not by me, but by Dr. Donna, and the schools communities are eating it up. And I gave a presentation for a conference for anybody in the Chicago area who cared about police and policing in the Chicago area. And so it was I did the keynote on whole brain living, and then there was a panel of all these different pieces of the police puzzle who presented as a panel. And then I closed it out with referring whole brain living back to what the things that they brought up and that they cared about, and how whole brain living can be used to shift in a positive way the kinds of problems that they face as a police department. And so there were 2 representatives there, one from Senator Durbin and one from Senator Duckworth's team. And they loved whole brain living. Because the government's been looking for a program to essentially replace No Child Left Behind, because the funding ran out for that. It was a set time program, and they're looking for another national program. And so they actually invited us in April to submit a grant to bring whole brain living nationally, but we're nothing moves quick in politics right now. So I'm enjoying my summer, because I do have a feeling I'm going to be very busy next year.
Well, that is very exciting.
It's very exciting. So especially anybody in your audience who is interested in bringing whole brain living to a population. I'm not a machine. So I will you're lucky you got in on that educational programming, because I do that very rarely.
I know.
And I will be doing it again, probably, my guess is in spring of next year, because there's been so many people who have requested, when are you going to run the programming? And it's like, no, I don't run 3 programs a year. I run maybe 1 every other year. So if you want to get in on that, it's kind of like, if you see it come by, you might want to jump on it.
Yeah. Well, I consider myself very lucky. I got the email. I was like, I'm in.
Yeah.
One final question for you. If there was one other thing other than jump on the opportunity, if it presents itself to come into the course, that you could, the people listening could take away and implement for themselves right now in their life, what would that be? Yeah.
You know, to me, learning about whole brain living is like learning how to use a hand. A hand, when we're born, is just this thing, right? And it's eventually the baby brain realizes, can differentiate, oh my gosh, I did that. I made that hand squeeze, right? I did that. And so the hand then is a paw. And I can push with it, and I can pull with it, and I can flop something with it, and I can do some things with it. But as soon as my brain can differentiate those 4 different fingers, all of a sudden I have a whole new power, a superpower of how to grasp and do things in the world with those digits. Now my brain can differentiate real manipulation of the external world. And it's like a whole new world opens up. And that's how I feel about whole brain living. When you know these 4 different parts of who you are, when you can know that in this moment right now, not all the energy, but most of the energy in my brain is in the left rational thinking tissue of my left hemisphere. And I'm now using that group of cells that gives me all these very specific skill sets, like language, like details, and more details about those details, all that information. It gives me a self-identity of who I am. It gives me the boundaries of where my body begins and where it ends. I'm a me. I can now communicate as that part of me. When I know that part of me, I can call on that part of me in an instant. And I give my 4 different parts names because they match the character profiles that those groups of cells manifest. So I encourage everyone, the better you can differentiate the different parts of your brain. And, you know, I wrote the book in 20, it was published in 21. In the course of those few years, I've probably given 300 podcast interviews. I'm everywhere. If you want to know more about those 4 characters, just hunt down Jill Bolte Taylor on YouTube. And I'm thinking you're probably going to find something or another. But I really encourage you to get the material, get the book, study the book, because in the book, there is then end of the chapter on character 1, rational thinking. It asks you very specific questions about your character 1 so that you think about that part of yourself. When does that part of you come out? Where does that part of you tend to hang out? What skills does that character 1 do? Who in your environment likes that part of you? Who reaches out to that part of you? Who runs the other direction from that part of you, right? Who, for all 4 of these parts of your brain. And really once you get to differentiate yourself, then, and you learn the huddle and how to bring them all into communication. And then the back of the book is practical application into the real world. What's going on? How can I recognize this? How has the world resulted in the development of these characters as a social norm? It's fascinating material. And the only way we came to this material at this level was because a Harvard-trained brain anatomist had a hemorrhage, lost literally 2 of those 4 characters, pretty much 3 of those 4 characters in the early days. So who is in my right hemisphere? This book brings 3/4 of the brain, which is technically considered our unconscious, into conscious. we can know who we are. So this is whole brain living. I just think I feel so blessed that, you know, this has been my journey. It's my life. I had this experience. I recovered. I came back. I've had the privilege of sharing this material. And now I feel like, okay, now I want to go play. That's why I don't teach it very often, because I want to go play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's such a privilege to read it, to learn it, to hear you talk about it, because it really, your story is so remarkable. And I think it's really such a gift to all of us to have learned this from you. Yeah. It a lot of people would not have necessarily shared it. You know, that you might have stopped it.
Yeah.
You know, at my stroke of insight, that all was amazing. But to have gone the extra distance, you know, to share all of this. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you for all of that. And thank you for taking the time to speak with me and speak with all of us on the podcast. This has been such a great honor.
Thank you.
Oh, no, please. This has just been phenomenal. And at some point, I remember you saying that you might be doing a certification. I have to get in on that because I work with physicians. I work with them in burnout. No, being one myself. I had to pivot out of clinical practice. And this is what I do now to stay in touch with my people. So I would very much want to do it. So I have to know about it when it happens.
Good. Well, I'll make sure you're on that list. And anybody, if anybody in your audience is interested, you know, you can reach me at Dr. Jill at drjilltaylor.com. I take things pretty much more right brain, how they come.
Yeah.
And I know I need to do a certification because I have so many people who have requested that. And it's like, okay, you know, so I'm not the machine that just wants to crank it out, crank it out, crank it out. And there are so many people who really wish I would do that. I'll get there.
Pigpen wants to play.
The Pigpen wants to sculpt in stone, you know? I mean, it's just like, and that's the beauty of the right hemisphere is it's like the richness of life. And I, you know, it's just the beauty of what we are in the present moment versus, okay, I'm going to put this on my schedule. It's going to be a course that I'm developing and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, at some point Pigpen will say, okay, I'm feeling satisfied. Helen, you can go make a course.
Oh, when Helen's doing that, I'm in.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Jill.
I appreciate your time. I really appreciate what you're doing. I appreciate you including me. And who knows how the future will grow. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, and I appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you, listeners, for being here and for listening today for our talk with Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor. If you haven't already, check out her TED Talk, which is just one of my favorites of all time. The link will be here in the show notes. And I hope it serves you in some way. And if it does, please share it with your friends and family. And leave Seriously Catherine a review if you're enjoying your time with us. My biggest takeaway from today, from Dr. Jill, the most poignant thing, I think, was the way she described getting through the whole experience of her stroke. She attributed it all to her mother's love. I thought that was so beautiful. And the other part was the responsibility that we all have to notice the energy that we are carrying around with us and bringing into the room that we are entering, that we're responsible for that energy that we bring into every conversation, every interaction, and just to notice that. It really matters. You know, as she was there, unable to speak, unable to, communicate with others, she could feel the energy of the people coming into the room with her. And she noticed when the caretakers and the doctors and the nurses came in with compassion for her. And she noticed when they came in just kind of matter of fact. That really struck me. Remember that we all have a responsibility for the energy we bring into the rooms we enter. So until next week, we'll see you then.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. And if you want to connect with me, slide into my DMs on Instagram. My handle is Catherine Hover.